Joining me today is the award-winning writer behind Wiper, Salem Brownstone, Tumult, and Summer Shadows. You've also seen his work appear in The Guardian, Esquire, and GQ. He is here today to talk about his upcoming queer horror crime whodunnit over at Dark Horse Comics Ripperland with co-writer Steve Orlando and artist Alessandro Oliveri. It is my pleasure to welcome John Harris Dunning onto the Oblivion Bar Podcast.
Hey guys, I'm so pleased to be in the bar. I love this show, so make mine a double.
Double on the rocks, ready to go. Here it comes.
Love it.
John, it is such a pleasure to finally get you here on the Oblivion Bar Podcast. We were sort of chatting about this before the recording, but I think it's worth bringing up to the listener here that, we first met at New York Comic Con 2023. I was just sort of chatting with Christian Ward right in front of his booth, and I don't know. I feel like I've heard this conversation or this note from you in other conversations, but you sort of walked up and we started chatting immediately.
Yeah.
Well, I guess my first question would be, how do you know Christian, and what were you doing there at New York Comic Con that year?
Well, Christian and I are old friends. I remember him getting his first payment check from Marvel and him being so excited he wasn't sure that he's going to cash or not. It said Marvel on it. So that was a very long time ago. So yeah, we're old buddies, and he's always been like he is, I think, with a lot of people, who are amateur and more, maybe a little bit more professional, but he is such an unbelievable supporter of comics talent and the most wonderfully generous man. So, he's been one with me, but he's been that with a number of people and continues to be. So he's really one of the good guys in comics, that's for sure. And obviously, just ridiculously talented as both a writer and as an artist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't want to make this into like the let's butter up Christian Ward hour.
I'd love to.
I think he knows that we both love him and that he has lots of fans. He's been on the show more than anybody, and I've only been friends with him for 2 years.
Yeah.
So we've been doing the Oblivion Bar for almost 5, if that tells you anything.
Excellent.
So I will echo all of what you said. And when we met that day, I was lucky enough to get a copy of your OGN through Dark Horse Wiper here.
Yeah.
You signed it for me, which was super nice. And I feel like, almost immediately I was aware that like just chatting with you in this brief, what was it? Like maybe 10 minutes? Somewhere in there. I was like, this guy, he's got it in some way. Like you get that feeling when you meet someone, you're like, they just understand the medium and they're going to do something really big in there. And I don't want to make this again the butter up John hour either, but I'm probably going to do it a couple times here and there.
Yeah.
But we'll get into all that here in just a moment. I want to briefly just immediately segue as soon as we start this conversation. We were supposed to meet last night. Here's a little behind the scenes, everybody. We were supposed to meet last night and have a conversation, but I got a press screener to go see A24's new film, Queer. And that was over there at the Alamo Draft House here in Indianapolis. And when I mentioned it to you and asked you if we could possibly reschedule for the next day, you mentioned that you loved the book Queer.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, I'm assuming you're planning to go see the film, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've actually also got a preview screener for it now, but I'm actually not seeing it until I can see it on the big screen. And it hasn't come out here in London. It comes out just after Christmas, so I'm saving myself. I'm really excited here. Queer is actually one of my favorite books of all time, and Burroughs is probably my favorite writer, and it's kind of my sort of literary daddy. When I started writing as a young man, he was the person I looked up to most, really, and I still really, really admire him enormously. And I think one of the reasons I admire him so much is, he was able to walk this line between being extremely experimental, extremely avant-garde, but then he wrote books like Queer, and Queer is just kind of a deceptively simple book. It's beautifully written. It is absolutely devastating, really quite small, short book, but just incredible. So, he can do what's supposedly very simple, and then he can do extremely kind of way out and avant-garde. And actually, if you look in the beginning of Wiper, the opening quote is Burroughs. The quote, "I'm getting so far out that one day I won't come back at all." And that
look at that.
To Allen Ginsberg. I love that man. He's just incredible.
Well, it's interesting to hear you say that about the book and how it maybe is like ultra simple, because watching the film, I found it really challenging, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this eventually. I'd love to get in touch once you eventually see the film, and I'm definitely saying this incorrectly, so correct me if I'm wrong here. Director Luca Gardagino. I'm definitely saying that wrong.
Denigo or something. I'm terrible.
Yeah.
But yes, background.
Watching it, I'm watching this film. I go and see it with my partner Olivia, and we're watching it. And we're like, I know something good is happening here. When you watch a film and you just can't quite wrap your head around it. You can't put you can't give it a bear hug and sort of wrap your head around the story. And I'd read nothing going into the film. So watching this, I found it really challenging. I'm curious again to hear your thoughts on it, because by the end of it, I looked over at Olivia and I was like, I sort of understand what's going on here, but I don't. I need to look into more of this.
The thing is, a number of people have said this to me, and therefore it must be quite a liberal adaptation, because the book is extremely simple. I mean, the book is basically there's this older guy who's in a terrible state, who's kind of fixated on this younger, handsome man who he's not really sexually attracted to him. And it's how he tries to be with this guy and be vulnerable with this guy. And this guy's just not available. And of course, what you realize in real life is, because, Burroughs' work is all very autobiographical, he's basically just blown his own wife's head off. And he's in front of his children. And he's in a terrible state of shock. And so there's a sort of underlying sense of sort of dread and horror, which is never mentioned in the book. I don't know. I think it's alluded to somewhere in the film. I don't know, maybe right in the end or something. I heard say. So I don't know quite what they've done in the film, but the book is actually just this deceptively, as I say, simple encounter between these two men. What was so impressive to me as a young man is, I was growing up in South Africa. Being gay was obviously illegal. It was still illegal in England until quite recently to actually even discuss homosexuality positively in school or talk to children about it at all. People were actually, when I first got to London in the 90s, people were actually being arrested for owning William Burroughs books in private. So, his totally hardcore and kind of incredibly intelligently unapologetic way of being. And it's not pleasant always the way he writes and what he writes about, but he's so unapologetic, and this incredibly brilliant brain just blew my mind. I hadn't seen a gay man who was so unapologetic and so incredibly clever. I mean, few little pop culture references, and then we need to probably talk about comics, because I have to talk about those all day. But basically, one is, that the original video for Heart Shaped Box by Kurt Cobain, that was supposed to be.
Sure. I didn't know. I don't know. But that song shows up in the movie, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. So he wrote the video and he drew it, and he wanted Burroughs fucking him. Burroughs was in his 80s. He just wanted the whole video, Burroughs fucking him. That's what Kurt wanted.
Whoa.
So it was just like, and you can imagine the record company was like, maybe we could make another video for that.
Yeah.
And also Burroughs was like, who the hell's Kurt Cobain? Because Kurt sent this idea to him, and he's like, who's Kurt Cobain? So that was kind of hilarious. So he holds this quite sort of extraordinary space in popular culture, I think. And then he ended up like modeling for Gap, in the 1990s. He's this sort of strange, this strange beast who just seemed to be sort of quite not quite like anybody else, really.
Yeah, well, and I misspoke there. It was actually "Come As You Are." That was the song that shows up in the film. Sorry, spoilers for everybody, but there is a Nirvana song in the movie.
Right.
But that's interesting. Wow.
He loved him. He absolutely adored Burroughs, and they actually did a collaboration. Like it's called The Priest, they called him. And so Burroughs does the spoken word piece, and then Kurt noodles in the background with a guitar. So they did something when they were alive, and then Kurt sent him a painting of aliens, like grey aliens, and Burroughs sent him a portrait back as well. So they were exchanging paintings and stuff. There was this whole relationship going on.
What an interesting friendship there that bloomed out of seemingly nowhere, out of just a pure admiration for one artist to another, I guess.
Yeah, and I also think it was a really important time when like homosexuality was seen as a sort of outsider, sort of cowboyish thing to do. And obviously Kurt was arrested as a young man for spray painting "God is gay" on the wall, which he puts into all apologies. And so he really looked up to Burroughs as this person who just didn't give a shit about society and just made his own path. Oh, the second little thing that I forgot about, but I was trying to remember, is that Kerouac writes this book called Desolation Angels. And in it, he talks about Burroughs, who he calls Old Bull Lee. And he's this old guy who's just sitting, again, it's post him having blown his wife's head off. And he's sitting absolutely out of his mind on heroin. And all he's doing is he's got this set of encyclopedias and he's reading it from the beginning to the end, and he's starting again at the beginning to the end. He's just completely on his own in this room. And he's just reading these books over and over and over again. And Kerouac is like, this is such a tragedy because this is the most brilliant man of our generation and nobody's ever going to know who he is. And of course, Kerouac was dead, and then Burroughs became Burroughs. And actually, of all of those, beatniks became the most pervasive and the most long. He wrote more books, and he became, maybe the most long-lived in terms of popularity. So it was quite interesting. But he started late. I think he only published. I think Queer and Junkie were done like in his late 40s or 50s even, and he only became famous really in his 70s and 80s. So it was, he was a late bloomer.
Yeah, I mean. To kind of move into comics as well, we talk about Stan Lee and Jack Kirby didn't create the Fantastic Four until they were in their late 40s. So that's, I mean, for any creative person out there that's listening, if you, for some reason, feel like your time has passed and you can't get there anymore because you're in your early 30s, I'm looking at the mirror as I'm saying this as well. Yeah. You don't worry about it. You can create great things at any point in your life.
It's important. I completely agree with you. Absolutely. Yeah. That life experience is really, really important. So definitely.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so to transition here, I want to ask you, I mentioned it in the intro, but you've wrote pieces for The Guardian, Esquire, and GQ. Can you tell me a little bit more about that time there as a journalist?
Yeah, and I've written for Rolling Stone as well here in the UK, and I've written for the Financial Times as well. I mean, I've mostly written on film. I've been involved with film. I was involved doing casting on Sexy Beast by Jonathan Glazer. And, I still know him. Obviously, he's done incredible films like Under the Skin and, and won an Oscar. So he's a genius. And, so I've worked in film a little bit as well. And then I've interviewed people like John Walters and, all Takeshi Kitano and various people as well. And, and stuff. So I was always around film and writing mostly around film, actually, for those publications. And because I like film and I studied film in Africa.
Yes, I actually just bought The Zone of Interest on 4K from A24 like 2 days ago.
Zone of Interest is so amazing. But then so I enjoyed it so much. It's I enjoyed is the right word, but it's just it's such a masterpiece and so well deserved that win. And but then I went back and just recently rewatched Under the Skin, and it's so unique and incredibly beautiful.
Yes. Speaking of, A24 and buying things from them, last year for my birthday, if you're a AAA 24 member of theirs, which is like their exclusive club or whatever, you get a free birthday gift every year. And I didn't realize that I had this, but one of the gifts that you could get was the Under the Skin screen book. It basically just has the screenplay and a lot of bonus features and stuff. And I didn't realize that I had already bought it the year prior. So now I have 2 copies of the Under the Skin screen book.
Well, not too many. Make it 3, damn it.
I'm going to buy my 3rd next year. Oh, man. Well, that's interesting. I had no idea. Honestly, when we met for the first time, I thought you were just sort of breaking your way into the world of comics. So
the other thing is, it's interesting thinking about comics and, just bringing it back to being in New York. I think that was my first New York. I think that was the first time I went to New York Comic Con. Christian had been saying for ages, you've got to get over to the US and do that because, I'd only visited the US once before, about 300 years ago. Literally, it was the frontier towns then.
Yeah.
So
you came over the Mayflower.
Literally, yeah. Exactly. There was tea, there was a whole incident.
The whole big thing. We don't need to get into it.
But I just went to Los Angeles and then basically, I'd done comics here, I'd done some self-published comics, and then I did Salem Brownstone, which was a company called Walker Books here, which is kind of a kids' book publisher, and it was picked up by Candlebook in the US. And then I did this book, Tumult, the Self-Made Hero, here. It's translated into French by Press Lune, and then it was nominated for an award at Angoulême. And so it felt like my center was more European for a while. But the reality is, the French have got such an incredibly strong market that if you're not writing in French, it's very hard to compete with French writers. And so because unfortunately, like I'm dumb and only speak English, I had to basically...
Same.
Yeah, exactly. I had to sort of refocus over to the US. And the reality is, when I think about it, what I grew up reading was, mostly American comic books really as a kid until my teens when I read 2000 AD, which was, very, very, very important to me, because it was, it was the golden age of, Grant Morrison and Alan Moore and everybody writing for 2000 AD. It was absolutely incredible. So, that was mind blowing. But, it was important to come over to the US and connect with the industry. And it's kind of moved quite quickly since I've been over, and it feels, it's definitely been the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny you say that about sort of the French comic market too. I want to quickly go back to that because, well, firstly, I should say, I don't know if we ever talked about this when we met in New York, but I have a Mobius Silver Surfer tattoo right here. So,
I would have remembered that.
I'm obviously a huge fan, but also I just backed the two heavy metal Kickstarters they just released here recently. I think it was the heavy metal reprintings of the first issue, and I want to say it was like heavy. Oh shoot, now I'm spacing. It's like heavy. I'll have to look it up here in just a bit. But anyway, I'm excited for it because it's a lot. It's basically whatever heavy metal was before heavy metal, and then they eventually created that imprint. So excited to sort of deep dive into that because while I have a great appreciation for it, I'm not as knowledgeable or as like I haven't seen as much as I would like to. I would say.
Yeah, it's really amazing. I've got to know quite a lot of that material through going to Angoulême, where I go every year to the comic book convention there, and yeah, it's awesome. And I've hung out with Hodorowski quite a lot, who obviously did Inkal, and he's read my tarot cards, and he signed a few copies of Inkal for me as well. And he's a genius. Like those two working together is because obviously the two of them were supposed to work on the original version of Dune, and Salvador Dali was supposed to play the Emperor. And then when that collapsed in a heap, obviously that created Alien and Star Wars and everything. And then they went off to do this incredible masterpiece of a comic. So it was something really beautiful born out of catastrophe.
Right. I don't know if you can see it right here. I have the new printing of Inkal right there. So yeah, and that right there can convince you to check out that sort of subgenre of comics. It was a heavy Herlant, by the way. It's the seminal science fiction anthology Lives Kickstarter that just came out recently.
Right.
Very excited for that.
Right.
Well, and also I want to sort of build off this to, you just mentioned a minute ago how you, sort of came over, you wanted to start creating comics here in America. And, you've done work such as, again, Wiper. And of course, you're working on Summer Shadows right now through Dark Horse. But, speaking of Dark Horse, and I want to deep dive into that here in just a moment, but let's get into Ripperland, which is sort of the central pillar reason why you're here outside of just wanting to finally get to chat longer than 10 minutes in front of Christian Ward's booth at New York Comic Con. But, this first issue of Ripperland comes out on January 22nd, 2025. So when this conversation comes out, you've got about a month, everyone, to go check that out and make sure you get that on your pull. And here's a brief synopsis of the story. So the year is 2188 and Jack the Ripper has returned to London. For the last century, a shattered post-Brexit England has operated as a massive Victorian themed park in exchange for American military and financial protection. But when America's mogul grandson is killed in the heart of London, the delicate status quo is threatened. So, speaking of serendipitous New York Comic Con meetings, legend has it that you and co-writer Steve Orlando first met at New York Comic Con to discuss working together.
Yeah, that's true.
My question for you is, what was it about this story specifically that got you two both excited?
Well, it was, we generated it together, and it was a bit of a game of sort of catch. Steve is a really dynamic writer. I mean, he's somebody that I've admired for a long time. And he obviously is a bit of an enfant terrible in terms of he started off so young and was so successful, and has worked for the big two, which is something I have yet to do. And it was just such an interesting character. And I just really loved his writing. So I sort of reached out to him to meet with him. And he made the time because he's a very generous guy as well. Very, very clever guy too. And we sat down and he was just, we got on very well immediately, and he was just like, threw the ball into my court. It was just like, right, I'd love to collaborate with you. I'd love it to be something UK based because he's a total kind of Anglophile. He's like, I'd love it to be something UK based. Just tell me what you think. Like, come back with an idea. And I was like, oh God, like, it was just sort of around Brexit and everything. It was the last thing I want to do is anything around England, like apart from leave, So
try being an American right now.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's the same thing. I mean, it's the same level of like disappointing catastrophe. And so, it was just like, oh, don't wait. And then then I started thinking, but maybe I can be a bit playful about that. And we were both, Steve and I have both got like a healthy level of sort of criticism of the countries that we live in, as as much as we love them as well. I mean, that's why we are critical. So we got into like, oh, what do you hate about your country? Yeah, what do you love about your country? And then it was just like, well, what about if we played with that? And that became, the game, and that came through on the page. And I think that's really what we're doing, is we're being very satirical. I mean, this idea that England has become, a Victorian theme park with no technology and electricity for American protection, financial and military, is, probably going to happen next month, as it turns out. But,
it's actually on the book. It's scheduled already.
So that was a bit playful and a bit silly, but also, saying something more serious. And it was also just talking a lot about, it is interesting. I mean, there's no real British comics industry left here anymore. There's a sort of brain drain that happened to the US. And with all due respect, I have to come with my begging bowl to the US for work, like any English writers or artist. So there's a sort of slightly wry, conversation about colonialism and, the American colonization of the UK, which has happened in film, in TV, in comics, in almost every sphere. So, that's one way of looking at it. There's also another way of looking at this beautiful cross-pollination that happens. Both countries really influence each other. But, if one's being a little bit more cynical or satirical, one could look at it like that, and it's worth highlighting it. So that was sort of how it started. And then, you've read the first issue, and, you've got these two characters. You've got this American character who's, a member of, who's an FBI agent, Jesse Holden, who's sent over to the UK to work in concert with this Victorian, in inverted commas, detective Edwin Fogg, who basically just thinks he's a cosplayer. I mean, doesn't have any technology, have no forensic. He just thinks he's going to be worse than useless, and kind of just wants him to stay out of his way. But of course, then they start to become friendly, and they start to admire how each other work, and they start to realize the pressures they're under. And so, it's also a little bit of, as cynical as Steve and I were being, I think we're both actually very optimistic people, and we're both, quite loving people. And, we want to believe that actually, can't we all just love each other? Literally, in this case, actually, as it turns out, no plot spoilers, but, we do see a kind of positive outcome as well. And we love this kind of playing up the kind of Britishness and Americanness and the sort of cliches and, our foibles and failings. It was really cool to do it.
Yeah. Wow. I feel like I have so many things I want to touch on with your response there. Firstly, as like a dirty Yankee, I can tell you, like, as someone who is so unabashedly and sort of annoyingly patriotic, because my co-host Aaron and I both served in the military. That's where we met initially back in 2010. We see parts of the country that are sort of disheartening, things that happen. Again, go back to last month here in the US, and I can tell you very candidly that both Aaron and I are not extremely happy about what happened there with the election and sort of where we're headed as a country in general. But at the same time, I can't help but be I feel a little defensive towards, wanting to, the country and the US. And like you said, like, being cynical doesn't mean that you hate your country. It means that you're aware of its potential. Yeah,
that's exactly it, Chris. I mean, don't even start me. It's like, I grew up in Africa, but, the thing that saw me through was basically American product. I was obsessed with comics as a kid, obsessed with American TV, obsessed with films. And there was a real optimism and, hope and energy in them that I still really believe in. So, it's about protecting that. It's not about, wanting to burn the ship and, see it go down. It's more about like how important it is to protect that. I feel the same about the UK, with Brexit and just what a disaster that was. And, unfortunately, you don't corner the market in, iffy political situations. We've done exactly the same. In fact, it's all across Europe. They're struggling with similar issues. And it's about defending that and kindness. And how do we hold space for kindness? How do we hold space for understanding? And, it's like, I don't expect everybody to agree with me, as I'm sure you don't expect everyone to agree with you. It's just about trying to keep a space open where both sides can speak, people can, say their piece, and one can also keep one's own mind open. I mean, I'm aware that I have to work quite hard at that as well sometimes.
Yeah. What's interesting about that, and I wanted to briefly touch on sort of the colonialization of American sort of entertainment over to, the UK. I want to get to that, but I want to briefly just touch on what you just said there. Whereas like having both sides be able to have like an open dialogue with each other. And that's really difficult for me as someone who is like, I feel like I've always been liberal in some way. We don't have to make this a big political conversation, but I think there's a good base here. I feel like I've always been liberal in some sense, and I am like your prototypical, if like, in speaking in terms of the U.S. politics of it all, like I'm a veteran, I'm a white, cis, white male in the Midwest. Like I am the prototypical poster child for your new Republican. Like they're doing all these things for me and I don't want any of it. And I think that the open dialogue part of our politics in 2024 here in America is that, and you can tell me if I'm truly wrong here, and I'd love to hear the thoughts of the listener as well at some point, but I don't even care to hear the other side's argument anymore. And maybe that's like a weaponization of the people that I listen to, but everything that other side stands for to a certain degree, I wholeheartedly disagree with in like a very intense level. What are your thoughts there in terms of like equating that to like, let's say UK politics?
No, the thing is, it never has reached the level of vitriol or aggression that it did in the US. And, not wanting to put too fine a point on it, but nobody's armed. So there just isn't the same level of violence. There's nothing like the same death rate. We don't have a shortening, lifespan, which is, I think the US is the only first world country that actually has a shorter lifespan every generation. So there's serious structural problems going on. And I think that has reached kind of fever pitch. I still think it is important to leave some bridge of conversation because otherwise, if you look at how many people voted for and against whoever, we're not even talking sides. It's big swathes of the population. It's not like this is a tiny narrow margin of somebody voting this and it's like actually there's big blocks against each other, and there has to be somewhere bringing people together. And actually, we know that there is, which is you need somebody moderate in the middle, and those people seem to have disappeared. And the only way those moderates are going to come back is some kind of communication. But of course, that's me on a kind of intellectual level. Like I'm also a human being, and I would be super emotional in your situation, same as I really was super emotional in the UK, post-Brexit. I was literally spitting mad. I couldn't even speak to people who'd voted for us. Now it's sort of settled down and there's much more moderate situation. And now I feel more able to have conversations with people who are so incredibly stupid still vote. But, seriously, I feel like I'm more open to that. So I hope you guys get to that situation. And I'm sure you will, but it's a tough moment.
I saw a little twinkle of like satire when you said, I'm sure you will at some point. Because if we are nothing here in America, we are extreme in one way or another. But I agree. I hope so as well. I hope we eventually, once some time passes and we sort of, I hope this doesn't happen.
Because it's too, if those, like the culture wars and just all the conversation, like if you look at the radicalization of certain people who, again, sort of shall remain nameless, but, they may or may not be involved with the technology, basically maybe started off as such a utopian person has become so the opposite of what I understand as utopian. It's just bizarre. And that's all because of this kind of radical rivalry and pushing so that, people are becoming more and more embedded in their opinions and going further and further away from what they would have actually once thought. And that's a shame. It's sort of dehumanizing. So that's my kind of wish. God knows how you do that. Personally, I think the way you do that is, the way I do it as a creator is you try and create some sort of space that people can be in and have those conversations in a safe, maybe quite attractive space that maybe also is a bit of fun. That's quite a good stealth way of doing it. Because basically I grew up, as I say, in South Africa during apartheid, and it was a state of emergency, so there was no media that was allowed through, no newspapers, magazines, anything. The only thing that came through were comics, because everyone was just like, this is so childish, there's obviously nothing in there. So there was a lot of really serious anti-apartheid material coming through from the US in comics and from England as well, and Europe. So we were getting those messages, and I think comics are still a very powerful medium to have those conversations in.
Mm-hmm. I love that thought too, what you just said there about how like comics act as or like sort of a disguised through line of rationale and sort of bigger thinking, in that way. They've always been that. I mean, the X-Men are literally a pastiche for the civil rights movement and the disenfranchised, the LGBTQ community from the very beginning. Yeah. Like Stan has come out multiple times and said that, whether that's like rewriting history or not, I think it's pretty evident on page.
Totally. I completely agree with you. And, people, when you read about those guys and women who were involved in all of that, they were pushing the envelope. They were definitely involved in all that stuff. So of course it came through in their work.
Mm-hmm. And I'd like to sort of equate that to what you guys are doing here with Ripperland. You guys have three separate, and we'll say this sort of like broadly here, you have three separate voices from three different countries coming in and telling the story with, of course, you and Steve, but also Alessandro. Yeah. So I'm just curious, like, what's, and I want to sort of dive in this a little bit more. You sort of spoke on it a little bit already, but what are you guys wanting to say with this like long gestating relationship between the US and the UK?
That it can be made to work in surprising ways. I guess that's as basic as it is. I mean, with all due respect, like, okay, I am actually an African immigrant, if we're going to be quite honest, so, but my family was English. I grew up maybe even more English than people in England because that always happens in the colonies. I got back to England and, so I could be seen as very English. Steve is a very American dude. He's mouthy, he's lippy, he's hilarious. He loves wrestling. It's just, he's an unapologetic American. And so the two of us coming together could have been a real culture clash, but like we immediately got on, we loved each other, we found each other really hilarious, and it was really playful, and that says something. And I think there's always been that relationship. It's like, look at like, Led Zeppelin, look at the Beatles, look at this exchange that we've had constantly between the cultures in terms of music in particular, but also actors and filmmakers, and it's a real turn on that the two cultures are so different, and I think they both really feed each other. So I think it's it's like a really good sort of opposites attract date, really.
What's interesting is that I feel like, and I'm getting like secondhand bad info here, but I'm just curious from your point of view here. When I think of British folks here in the U.S., if they're here, first of all, we're like, hey, great accent, we love the way you talk. But also what I've heard through the grapevines, and maybe you can shed some light here, is that like, people in the UK do not like American, like if they're visiting the country. Have you found that to be true, or am I sort of getting bad info here?
I think you're getting bad info. I mean, in terms of, I think people bloody love it. Like people love the open spaces, they love the nature, they love the people. I mean, you guys are really friendly. I mean, nobody can say you're not friendly people. Everywhere. You get out in New York, and New York is supposed to be like more sort of hardcore. Fast-paced. People are.
I'm walking here.
Exactly. People are so much more friendly than they are in London. Like, so there's no. I think people love the US. I think Brits love the US when they go there. It's different, and but I think they really enjoy the energy. I know I do, and if I look at just my little tiny world of comic creators, like people just love going over and. They love going to the cons, and they love the people. And I've got loads of friends just from having gone a few times. And then obviously people traveling over to Thought Bubble in Harrogate, which is kind of our big convention as well. First met people like James Tinian there, and Liana Kangas, and loads of other people. And those relationships are really strong now. So I think I think it's a two-way street.
It's just, can I expose myself a little bit and tell you where this sort of thought came from? And it's a super silly, super stupid source, but I saw on the news the other day, they were talking about how a lot of British folks were giving great reviews to like terrible restaurants. And then it was, when Americans come over to the country, they go straight to like the reviews to figure out where to eat. Yeah. So in order to keep the American Yanks away from the good food, they would give great reviews to the bad places to make us go to the bad places. You've heard about this at all or no?
No, but that's absolutely hilarious. Not,
I agree.
it's this long-winded plot against food that I've heard in a very long while, but that's hilarious.
Oh yeah, I love it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, what you got. Wiper, you have Summer Shadows, and then now you have Ripperland over at Dark Horse Comics. These have all been distributed through Dark Horse Comics. We never miss an opportunity here at the Oblivion Bar to give Dark Horse their flowers. We absolutely love their marketing team from our perspective. When we want to interview creators or get early looks at comics, they are on the ball, ready to go. And I'm just curious, again, as someone who's sort of relatively new to the comic world, at least American comic world, you've published a lot of your best work and a lot of your recent work through Dark Horse. Just curious why that is, and what's been your relationship and sort of your experience with Dark Horse.
I mean, it couldn't have been better, I have to say, and I'm not just saying that. I mean, that's why I've kind of kept going back, and it's been a very natural relationship. And again, like not wanting to make the Christian Ward show, but basically he very generously introduced me to Dan Chabon, who's one of the senior editors there, and
one of the best.
He's amazing, and he actually commissioned my first book, which didn't happen because then suddenly along came COVID, and everything went on hold, etc. But that relationship had been opened, and he was working with an editor called Brett Israel, who was more junior then, but has become senior now, and so we stayed in touch, and as soon as we kind of came out of COVID, then they commissioned Wiper, and the game was on, and it's fantastic. I mean, I think what's interesting about them is, I've worked with other more independent publishers, and in terms of kind of big US publishers, they're the only one I've worked with. But obviously, I know an awful lot from, friends and colleagues and stuff. And I think the balance that they strike, which is quite special, is they're really pro, and they're really, they're on it. I mean, you really feel the editorial support. They're going through things, basically making you work better, making you look better, which is essential. But they're very, very respectful of creators. And so they'll be as involved or as uninvolved as you want. And I have to say, I'm not going to be some diva and be like, I don't need any editorial involvement. I like some editorial involvement, but I also know what I'm doing creatively. And they are 1,000% supportive in that. And that's been the experience of all the people I know who've been at Dark Horse. So it's quite special, to have that space. And I think, you need it, particularly if you're working in a creator-owned space, which is, what I've been working in. Is you want that support, but you want to be very free in doing what you want to do, and it just feels like I've timed very well with them. So I've been very lucky getting it.
I feel like that's the true sort of pillar personality trait for like a great creator. Not just in comics, but also just in general. When you can take sort of feedback and not just assume that everything that you do is perfect. And I agree with you. Everything that I've heard about Daniel and the team over there at Dark Horse has been glowing. Yeah. Never once have I heard a bad thing about how they handle with their stuff with creators and sort of the process that goes along, not only with new creators, but there's a reason why a lot of long-term creators take some of their creator work over to Dark Horse.
And go back after having worked with all sorts of people. It's also funny, Chris, it's like, you are a pro enough to realize as well, it's almost like the more I do in comics, the more I realize like what complicated craft it is. It's like there's so many different layers, and the assembly of it and the timing is quite tight by the time it's greenlit and you're going and you're handing art in and you're lettering and you're laying and you're coloring and so you really need a crack team, because so much can go wrong. I mean, it is extraordinary. Every project, there's like absolute, zingers and humdingers and whatever you want to call them. It's just like, you're like, how did I not see this coming? Like, I've done this before. How could this thing crop up? But there's always something like that, because that's the nature of the beast. So it's absolutely crucial to have a super pro team around you that can just, Wonder Woman like, bullets and bracelets. You need it. It's sure. Amazing having that kind of thing around you.
Speaking of hummers and zingers over here, I got to briefly, I don't have any like direct questions about it, but I just have to tell you, the first 3 issues of Summer Shadows has been excellent. Again, over there at Dark Horse Comics, you and artist Ricardo Cabrera, am I saying that correctly?
Yeah.
Cabral, excuse me. You guys are absolutely killing it. That first issue, talk about just hand someone the first issue and get them hooked right then and there. I'm going to talk about him again, and I know he's listening right now, Christian. When he's always telling me when it comes to creating comics, you got to have like a good hook, right? And this book here, talk about vampires on a Greek beach. I mean, what else do you need, and broken relationships and detectives, going in there and trying to find killers. It's something that I just hope doesn't get overlooked by readers today. Because when I go to my local comic book shop and I only see like at least one issue of Summer Shadows out there, I'm like, okay, good. People are buying this, and I love that.
Oh, I'm so pleased. Thank you so much. Look, it's such a weird thing, Chris, because like I thank you for those kind words, and it's just like I've had the most incredible feedback from people. I've had people like James Tinian coming back, Tynian. Sorry, I should use the correct pronunciation.
I think it is Tinian. I always say James or Tynan, actually. James Tynan.
It's Tiny Onion, the company, so maybe it's Tynian.
Right. I'm wearing my Tiny Onion shirt right now too.
Basically, he's been very generous, and Teenie Howard came over to Thought Bubble, and we were doing a talk together, and she was like, "This is my book of the year." So I mean, people have been really kind, but it's difficult because I'm not a big name yet, and people don't know Ricardo's work, so it is literally a word of mouth thing. So what I'm really delighted by is, to have your support, to have the support of a few other creators. And I think as it runs and it's then collected into trade paperback, I just have this belief that this thing will have a life, because it's come together in a way that, it's kind of surprised even us. We're really proud of it. And can't wait for you to see how it wraps up, because it's sort of the way we created it was almost like Dante's Inferno, where every issue gets more and more hardcore. Like, by the time you get to issue 3 and everybody's shagging on the yacht and everything's getting more and more crazy, and then issue 4 is like another level. So I'm really interested for people to go on that journey and, how you feel about the end of it.
Sure. And that is the last issue of the series,
That's
issue 4?
Yeah. It's just 4. Same as Ripperland. Ripperland is 4 as well, but I think both me and Steve and Alessandro would very much like to continue it. So we'll see. But it is a complete story arc in the 4. But we're so in love with the world now and the characters. Here's hoping that we get to do.
I can't wait for people to get their hands on that first issue. Again, comes out January 22nd. But John, I have one more question for you. We've had a great conversation here on the Oblivion Bar. We like to ask all of our guests, we like to leave them with basically one final question, which is, what are you loving right now? Well, you got one form of media, comic, movie, video game, podcast, what have you. What's something that you love and you want to highlight to the listeners today?
I'm actually just going to stick on comics, because I just think there are so many amazing comics at the moment. I mean, I have to say probably the thing that's blown my mind most is by this little known writer called Christian Ward. Don't know what he wants.
Christian is listening like ding,
exactly.
ding, ding, ding. All the
his
references.
Two-Face is so amazing. Yes. I mean, for a start, I just can't believe it's the first time it's Two-Face said his own book. It's crazy because, Christian loves Two-Face. I know he does, but I do as well. And I think a lot of people do. So that's really bizarre. But just what he did with that issue, the art that, the artist he's working with is incredible. And just the way he's unpacked it and brought this completely fresh perspective and the supporting cast. I think it's just amazing. Like so that's extraordinary. Absolute Wonder Woman is just, I could not be enjoying it more. I love Wonder Woman. And I think that's a real return to kind of my favorite period, which is the kind of, George Perez kind of 90s. And then just before that kind of 80s period is just my favorite period. And it's a real return to that. And then the last one I'm going to say is the Green Lantern Dark, which is just completely blown my mind.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
The writing and the art on that is just mind blowing. So I feel so jazzed about comics right now. I mean, I could go on endlessly, but I think we're in, because, same as the film industry, a lot of industries are struggling because there's so much tumult going on and political and financial and whatever, but the material is just so incredibly good. So I can't help but feel really jazzed about what's happening in the immediate future.
Mm-hmm. I agree 100%. And I love all 3 of those entries. I mean, Christian, of course, good friend of the show, but I would be the first to tell you if I didn't love everything that he does, but it just so happens that I do. And that Two-Face run, what I really appreciate, I don't know if I've actually told him this yet or not, but what I really appreciate is how Harvey, it's a pretty clear look at Two-Face and his priority of justice, right? like in the story, Zaz is, and the spoilers for everybody, I guess slight spoilers for the first issue of Two-Face if you haven't read it yet, but basically Zaz is on trial. Yeah, you should have already gotten it by now, everybody. Yeah. But Zaz is on trial, and you can tell that although things happen there towards the end of that issue, the one thing that Harvey's interested in is the justice of it all. He wants to lay out the entire problem and have the jury figure it out. And he wants to do that to the best of his ability. And I love that sort of through line. And of course, the teaser there at the end of that first issue is phenomenal.
And I agree with you. I just find it strange that I think about how many Two-Face stories I've read, and yet that is never really unpacked very much. Is that the fact is Harvey was a good man, and he's only half evil. So there is this goodness, which isn't usually played with as much. It's really cool to dig into that. And I think he's done a great job on it.
Yeah. With Absolute Wonder Woman, I agree. It's my favorite of the 3 new Absolute series thus far. And the other 2 are great. I'm not saying that's not like
exactly.
any
that's high praise. I agree. Both of them are great, but that is just, it's so in the spirit of her as well. Like it's got gravitas, but it's got that kind of mythological playfulness without it being silly. And it's still quite funny. And the whole hell should be, if it wasn't played right, it would just be too much and kind of like too many ideas. But it's absolutely pitch perfect that there's this like touch of darkness that she carries so lightly. It's so clever that like you can't Wonder Woman. She still stays kind of cheerful and upbeat and heroic. It's just wonderful.
Yeah, and you said it so perfectly too. It's like Kelly and Hayden have perfectly encompassed sort of the, I want to say silly, and don't hear what I'm not saying here. There's like a little bit of silliness to it, and they're like capturing it perfectly and balancing that darkness with it, which I also think that Tom and Daniel are doing really well on the normal ongoing run.
Really enjoying that too.
Just really encompassing like what's great about Wonder Woman, I think first and foremost, is that she's badass, and like no one does it like her, right? Yeah.
No, I agree. I agree. Like I'm collecting that as well. It's fantastic, and I'm such a big Wonder Woman head. I love basically DC and Marvel editors. Listen closely, because I love those. I love those female characters, like Wonder Woman, She-Hulk, Spider-Woman, like Dazzler. Like those characters when I was growing up were like my favorite characters. They're really interesting. So there's really cool stuff to be done with them, and I think those guys are absolutely nailing Wonder Woman in particular.
Yeah. And just to briefly touch too, you said Green Lantern Dark as well. Great first issue. Tate and Werther absolutely knocked it out of the park. I was sort of nervous that there was only going to be one issue initially, but I'm so happy to hear that this is going to be like an ongoing thing. And Tate's really,
for me, it's like the thing that I loved about comics as a kid, and I still love about comics as a grown up. Is like you kind of want to crawl in, like if the comics didn't, if you want to crawl into the world and inhabit it. And with Green Lantern Dark, it's just like that is a real return to absolutely classic Green Lantern, where you just want to be in that world. Like it's realized the world building in it is so incredible that you just want to be with those characters in that space. It's a huge achievement.
You described that perfectly. And you want to know a series that actually made me feel exactly like that was The City Beneath Their Feet by aforementioned James Tynion and artist Elsa Chartier. Yeah. Perfect. Like when you see those Jordi Bella colors, colors, and then obviously Elsa's interiors and James's incredible script, it's like perfect comic book making.
Perfect comic book making. I couldn't agree with you more. Like firing on all cylinders, and we're just so lucky to have these creators out there.
Yeah, agreed 100%. Well, John, that's all I have for you today. I don't want to keep you too long here. I truly, truly appreciate you coming here onto the Oblivion Bar podcast. And as I said a moment ago, I'm going to say it one more time. Ripperland #1 hits shelves on January 22nd, 2025. And I want to end the conversation by saying this here. I said this, I sort of prefaced this conversation with this. I want to reiterate it again. I knew when you and I have a conversation there in front of Christian's booth there at New York Comic Con that, I needed to get you on here to talk to you about comics and everything else in between. But I don't want my word to be it here with the listeners here. If you can't take my word, true believer, take this word here. How about from a legend really quickly? A wonderfully imaginative and stylish piece of work and a perfect example of the adventurous new direction that comics should be taking in the future. And also, JDH is super cool. That's the words from Alan Moore. Alan Moore actually gave that little, we'll say like a, what do you call it? Like a a pull quote. There we go. A pull quote for Tumult with your work there with Michael Kennedy. And actually, the JDH is super cool part was actually from me. But I think Alan Moore would agree, right?
That was it was quite funny because basically I asked Alan to do a pull quote. It was actually for I think the information might have been misdelivered to you, but basically it was for the one before that. It was for Salem Brownstone, which is a bit more sort of magical. And basically I asked him if he would do a pull quote for me, and he was like, "I'm really sorry, I don't do pull quotes." And I was like, "Okay, that's fair enough." And I went off and I bought a crystal ball from Madagascar, which is a little island off Africa. And
sure, I've seen the movie.
And then I bought some 1930s Nancy Drew notebook paper original, and I wrote him a letter saying, "Alan, I know you said you don't do pull quotes, but would you mind looking into this crystal ball? And once you've done that, tell me whether you see it in your heart to like send me a pull quote."
The crystal ball will find what's deep in your heart.
He came back with a pull quote. It was just like, okay, line. You worked hard enough for it. So that was the Great Magician. And then I met him a few times after that, and it was such an honor because he is obviously like one of the great writers of our of our times, and he's certainly one of the greatest comic writers ever. But he is a magician. And there's something very, very special and unusual about him. So I felt very lucky to have met him a couple of times. What a cool guy.
I envy you. And now I only have one question, which is, what was the ink that you used to put into your, like you wrote the letter and put it in your crystal ball? Was it like goat blood, or did you use like a fairy dust of some sort?
No,
what was it that you used?
Yeah.
Oh no, we can't divulge too much here.
Can't divulge too much. Yeah, exactly.
All right, John. Well, I'm going to pass the baton off to you one more time here. Is there anything you want to plug or say to the listeners before we head out of here?
No, not at all. Just, thanks for picking up Ripperland on the 22nd of January. I'm also on social media as well. So I love hearing back from people. Tell me what you think. I'd love to hear your perspective.
All right. Awesome. Well, John, thank you so much. And we'll talk to you here soon.
Thanks for having me. Such a pleasure to be on.